So my main goal this evening is to focus less on the specifics of my research and more to introduce you to the field that I work in, comparative physiology. You know, I'm from the States, and in the US, the National Science Foundation funds a lot of the basic research that happens in the country. And of course, you know, we have a responsibility to the public because it's publicly funded science to explain why we do what we do with the funding that we get. And this is particularly important back home because there's sort of these, you know, it's government, right? So there's these hearings that happen, and you know, people get dragged up from the National Science Foundation governing body, and they get put in front of senators, and they say, "Why the heck are we using taxpayer funding for you to exercise shrimp on treadmills?" Right? Like that's a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation. And so, you know, mostly what I'm hoping to do tonight is to explain that, you know, yeah, actually, we should be exercising shrimp on treadmills. So over the course of my career, I've been very fortunate to work with a number of incredible species. During my master's, I worked with northern elephant seals on the coast of California. During my PhD, as Katie mentioned, I worked with fish that live in tide pools on the coast of BC. And here at McMaster University, I'm studying the physiology of mice, deer mice that live at the top of the Rocky Mountains. And of course, these animals are all incredible in their own right and in many ways. But the aspect of their biology that most fascinates me is their ability to deal with low oxygen conditions. Okay, what's the deal with oxygen? We have this intuitive understanding that oxygen matters. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, the reason oxygen matters is because animals use, and plants for that matter, they combine oxygen with fuels that we take up in our food. And we burn that fuel to provide energy for powering all of the critical functions we need to live, right? So things like nerve function, muscle contraction, digestion, lots of these processes that happen, they require the burning of our food fuels with oxygen. We also kind of intuitively understand that the amount of energy we require, and therefore the amount of oxygen we require, can vary depending on conditions. So for example, if we go from sort of a steady walk and then start sprinting, we're gonna need a lot more energy to power that increase in muscle contraction. So we're gonna need to, you know, release more energy. That means we're gonna have to burn more fuel with more oxygen. Okay, so what happens if we start moving in the other direction, right? Maybe if you can imagine yourself in a resting, you know, condition, maybe you're laying down on a bed, you're not doing anything, you're not digesting, you're not moving around. You're really trying to minimize the amount of energy you need. You still need to take up oxygen, you still need to burn fuels, right? So you've got this minimum level of energy you need to spend and minimum level of oxygen you need to consume just to stay alive. But what happens if oxygen starts to decrease in the environment? And not just in the environment, but just to kind of bring things home in a human health context, this is the kind of thing that can happen sort of locally in a particular organ with something like a heart attack. Part of your heart loses access to blood flow and therefore loses access to oxygen. And the cells in that part of the heart can die, and that can compromise heart function. Same thing with stroke. You lose oxygen and access to oxygen in the brain. And of course, we're all very familiar with the effects of COVID, which can attack blood vessels and therefore the ability of tissues to receive oxygen. So if we start to fall below those levels of oxygen required to support that minimum level of function, that can compromise the energy we can produce and threaten our ability to maintain these critical functions that support life. And, you know, I'm here because I study physiology, not because I'm an artist, but you understand that this can threaten, this can be life-threatening. But of course, there are organisms that are adapted to low oxygen conditions. So they've sort of solved this question of how do you keep life going under oxygen-limiting conditions. So of course, the seals were interesting because they spend 90% of their lives submerged, breath holding while they're diving. And they're doing everything they need to do. They hunt, they reproduce, they do all those things with very limited oxygen during those dives. These tide pool sculpins live in pools that, while they're immersed from the ocean, especially in summertime conditions during the evening, everything that's living in those pools can suck up the oxygen out of that water and really threaten the ability of these organisms to produce energy using oxygen. These fish have figured it out. And of course, at the top of the Rocky Mountains, we've got a decrease in atmospheric pressure. That also decreases the availability of oxygen. And these mice not only have to deal with a low oxygen condition, but as small mammals, they have to generate huge amounts of energy to keep themselves warm. And they're able to do that at the top of the Rocky Mountains. So they've also solved this low oxygen challenge. Okay, so it's all well and good that fish, mice, and seals have solved these low oxygen challenges. But you might be wondering, what does this have to do with anything we might care about as people? So setting aside sort of the academic value of understanding how these animals have adapted to low oxygen, there are implications for things like human health. And this is because across these species, there's actually an incredible unity across the diversity of life. So, fish and mammals are separated by about 400 million years of evolution. But despite that evolutionary separation, they still need to keep this process going. They still need to eat. They still need to burn the food that they've eaten using oxygen to produce energy to keep living. And I've hidden quite a bit of biology in these arrows. But if we were to take a cell, let's say from a mussel, from this fish, this mouse, and this seal, if you were just looking at that cell, you wouldn't be able to tell whether that cell was from a fish, a seal, or a mouse. And that's because the same structures that exist in a fish muscle cell are also present in these other species. This is true also for the biochemical pathways that support the function of those structures at the cell level. And so really, especially at the level of the cell, there's this incredible unity in how life works. And if we understand adaptation at this level, then that might help us understand how we can solve some of the challenges that we face in a human health context. And just to very briefly mention some of the stuff I'm doing here at McMaster with these deer mice, most of the work I've done over the course of my career has been to think about how these animals have solved the problem of low oxygen. But here at McMaster, I'm also really interested in this idea of how they're matching the delivery of fuel to match the level of oxygen that's available. And the analogy I like to think of, it's a bit of a dated analogy because most engines don't have carburetors anymore, and this is less of an issue. But in order for cars to work, in order for your car to be able to burn the fuel inside of it and produce force to move the car forward, you actually have to have a very precise delivery of the amount of fuel relative to the amount of oxygen that's injected in order to get that fuel to explode and to produce movement. And there's actually a sort of similar nature to the challenge that these organisms face when oxygen varies, both within a particular tissue and across their body, to ensure that they're matching fuel delivery to the oxygen they're able to consume. And this has important implications for aspects of metabolic health in humans. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you that comparative physiology offers an opportunity to learn from species that have solved these problems we really care about, and that, at the end of the day, we probably should be exercising shrimp on treadmills. Thank you.